Time for something different on the state of the nation, and no less important than politics and economics is the subject of leadership. Not necessarily a topic that we handle particularly well in South Africa. We've seen so many people in key positions, be it in government or in business, that one wouldn't classify as great leaders. And perhaps this is because we don't do enough leadership training. And one of those people who is moving the needle is Dr. Nick Eberl. Nick, welcome to the State of the Nation.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, good. It really is a topic, that I said to you before. It's something that I'm passionate about. I think that South Africans could do better in the leadership stakes. I think that sometimes, in South Africa, we are reluctant leaders. Right. There's a lot of consensus. There's a lot of talks, a lot of summits, a lot of lechotlas. We've got names for days, but what we need sometimes is somebody who gets out there and makes a decision. Now, just by way of background, you are German, but you've got a long South African track record.
That's right. I was born and bred in Berlin, the divided city.
Yes.
I am a brandologist by trade, so I studied and have been consulting on brand leadership ever since. I came out as a lecturer in '94, just before the elections, University of KZN. And I lectured there, went into Joburg, into business, and then had the good fortune of covering Germany's rebranding campaign. If you remember, Germany hosted the FIFA World Cup just before 2010.
Yes.
And they used it as a platform to rebrand the country. Obviously, they had a terrible brand image, and they very effectively rebranded the country and the people in the 31 days of the FIFA World Cup.
Yes.
2006.
Yes. And the big point of that rebranding at the time was to make Germany seem less severe, less serious, more fun, playful.
Yeah, less boring, less of a factory.
Yes.
More like a party, and that's what they did. They hosted a great party for the world. The world fell in love with Germany. Germans started to fall in love with each other. And I did the research report on how Germany won the World Cup of nation branding.
Yes.
And it had a massive impact on the economy, on tourism, on civic pride, on so many elements. And it catapulted Germany to the second spot in the Nation Brand Index.
Yes. And then it must have been fascinating for you with that branding background.
Absolutely.
To have witnessed the World Cup in 2010 in South Africa.
Well, I published this book late 2006. I then got roped into the destination branding campaign for 2010, because at the time South Africa was facing a similar branding dilemma, right? South Africa was seen as an unsafe destination to visit and to invest in. So for 4 years, I was working with Brand South Africa, South African Tourism, and many other stakeholders to put together the Brand Ambassador program to basically empower everybody in hospitality, which was 500,000 service employees, to convert visitors into brand ambassadors for the country.
Do you think that succeeded?
Well, the key benchmark that they measured, amongst other things in Germany, was the visitor advocacy. So how many visitors that went to Germany, watched the World Cup, went back and became brand ambassadors for Germany? 88% in Germany. So our mission was to actually better that, and I'm very pleased to say collectively we achieved a 92% net promoter score. So 92% of visitors went back as brand ambassadors, and that's why it had such a big impact on many dimensions in South Africa. And it had everything to do with leadership. Because at the end of the German campaign, President Beki made a very profound promise, and that is to, quote unquote, to host the most successful World Cup ever. Which at the time, hardly anybody believed, because Germany was so successful. And if you remember the run-up to 2010, there were many, many challenges. I mean, we had xenophobia, we had Coburg, the first bouts of load shedding, we had the financial crisis that wiped out many economies around the globe, right? We had things like the attack at the Africa Cup of Nations on the Togo team. We had the outbreak of the volcano in Iceland. I mean, that was April, May 2010, right? A few weeks before the World Cup, and stopped air traffic, international air traffic, for weeks. So we forget these things, but the situation before 2010 was quite particular and not too different from where we are now.
Yeah. Now I know that we're here to talk leadership, but let's talk. Let's sort of explore the branding a little bit further, because Germany certainly, if one goes back to that 2006 World Cup, definitely did a job on this, making Germany appear to be less serious and more fun. South Africa seemed to go the other route. It seems like South Africa's on the branding front. We are desperate for legitimacy, and we have these serious campaigns, mountains and people looking very serious. Not a lot of fun. Have I got that wrong?
Well, inspiring new ways, that is a brand promise of South African tourism, has been for quite a while. And if you look back to 2010, why 2010 was such a success? In my view, it had everything to do with leadership. And I was documenting the World Cup in the run-up to the World Cup day by day in the media. I wrote for the Business Day, I was on CNBC Africa and many other channels. So I had a bird's eye view. And what happened, you might remember, is that everybody was aligned, really aligned, to Beki's brand promise to make this a big success. From government to business to civic society, even the churches. Everybody played their part. And I think that was definitely a leadership imperative. And there was a very clear leadership ROI, right? I mean, not only did the visitors rate it the best World Cup ever, tourism went up 31%, business tourism 47% in Cape Town, the exchange rate 7 rand to the dollar. That was 2010.
Yes. And who led that process?
It was really from Beki and everybody buying in. Business, obviously the sponsors, obviously FIFA, but it was very much on a country level, all the stakeholders. Because there was, for some reason, everybody perceived the benefit of hosting a great World Cup, rebranding the country. And what it did, it obviously brought the people back together.
Now, it seems like since 2010, South Africa has had a bit of a brand crisis and a leadership crisis, because all of that goodwill built up at enormous expense seems to have gone in the wind by probably bad leadership. Is that the way you see it?
Well, the way I see it is that we need to look at the micro picture. So yes, there's macro, there's politics, there's economics, but if you look at, in my view, the future will be determined, the quality of the future will be determined how we interact one-on-one, person to person, people to people, how we treat each other. And if we simply shout at each other, if we disrespect each other, yes, we're going to keep having problems as a society. But if we start treating each other better, with more respect, if we start uplifting each other, and I think that is it's a personal decision for everybody to make, is how you interact with other members of society, whether it's at the filling station, in traffic, rather than cutting somebody off, being more considerate, right? That to me is a key determinant. And the leadership crisis we're seeing in the world, I mean, just look at the likes of America. As you know, we have elections, many elections coming up next year. We've got the US, we've got Germany, I believe we have France, Britain. There's some big elections coming up next year.
And there's a South African election coming up, and that's
Absolutely.
going to be quite an interesting one, which we've covered in great detail. What do you think is the status? I mean, South Africans seem quite angry. It's been 10 hard years. We've seen, big blows to the confidence in almost every way. And then, of course, you've got the lights going out, which, of course, doesn't tend to improve your mood, right? How would you rate the state of leadership in South Africa?
Well, I think what we need is another catalyst like 2010, like 95, if you remember. 2019, the Rugby World Cup also brought the country back together, the people back together. And that's really the dimension I'm looking at, I'm studying, I'm reviewing, I'm analyzing. How do we build a nation? Because I believe if we work together as one nation towards one common objective, many things can be overcome, including load shedding and so on.
Yes.
Obviously, many crises are induced globally, like the energy crisis.
Yes.
We had COVID, obviously hit us hard. We lost 2 million jobs. And again, that was a global crisis. And there's probably more to come, right?
So it seems to me that, and having experienced it, that South Africa was driven largely by these big sort of catalyst events. We had 94 in itself, the first elections. The Rugby World Cup on your shores, put out your best game. There was the Cricket World Cup in 2003, which was a galvanizing moment. There was one of the big summits. It was the big COP summit, etc.
Right.
Then the World Cup in 2010 was obviously a massive sort of moment that we were building up for, and it seemed to me that it gave the country an objective. Subsequent to that, we haven't had those external objectives or those targets set by events. It seems to me that you've got to do one of two things. Either we've got to recalibrate to lead without these big events as the extraneous factor, or we've got to have events, one of the two, right? And there aren't that many events out there. We're not going to get the World Cup again in our lifetimes, just because it's not going to happen.
We might, because the Women's World Cup is coming up,
yes,
27.
But we wouldn't have, and with the best respect to the Women's World Cup, fantastic event that took place recently, but it doesn't have the scale necessarily of the Men's World Cup. The only thing that could surpass that would, I'd imagine, be the Olympic Games, and we don't even seem to be pitching for those things anymore, and it would be laughed out of court when you can't keep the lights on. So it seems to me that South Africa has to recalibrate to becoming a normal, boring, successful country. And I use that word advisedly because, we spoke about how Germany changed from being boring, machine-like factory to being this fun place. But
That's right.
There is some merit in boring, isn't there? There's some merit in consistency in a country.
Well, I think like any brand, company brand, personal brand, if you are predictable, people will trust you more. So yeah, you have to be consistent and you have to be predictable in a good way.
Yes.
That's true.
Now, let's move on to the topic purely of leadership, because you are running the Future Leadership Summit.
That's right.
Where you've written a book. This is going to be an annual summit. You've got some eminent people contributing to this thing. There's quite a number of speakers. But do you think the time has come? You obviously do, otherwise we wouldn't have arranged the event. So you're feeling that the time has come for us to start talking about leadership. Tell us more about that.
Well, the Future of Leadership Summit is very much a 2010 legacy project. So obviously in 2010, the country came together, everybody came together with one common objective. And it had a lot to do with leadership. So ever since 2010, I've been looking at how can we recreate that sense of leadership and what was called the gees, right? The spirit, which is important. That's why I've been interviewing 250 leaders across society. So not just public and business leaders, sporting leaders, academics, civic society leaders on the future of leadership. One simple question, many questions, but the most pertinent question was, what does the future of leadership mean to you? And that's really what we're going to examine at the summit. So at the summit, we're bringing 150 public and private leaders together to examine key aspects of leadership, key dimensions, such as the future of leadership diversity. The D School Africa, the design school, UCT, is going to host a panel on the future of leadership thinking, right? Old Mutual is going to talk about the future of leadership skills. Nedbank is going to host a panel on the future of financial inclusion. FNB most likely will talk about the future of entrepreneurship. And Brand South Africa, interestingly, is going to host a panel about South Africa and what is the South Africa we want to create, right? So all these different dimensions of leadership, but it's not a talk shop, it's actually an action job. So what we're looking at is to co-create, because it's the future of leadership, in my view, has to be co-created by leaders, right? and not by us sitting around, by leaders. So to co-create solutions, coming out of the summit will be workshops that we will turn into action, into solutions at one of South Africa's leading design schools, and then present, and hopefully working together, especially business and public, very much like the CEO initiative, will give birth to some solutions that we need.
Now, Nick, my own business used to be quite active in the leadership space back in the mid-2000s. And at that point in time, the model was quite clear globally. America were riding high, and you had books coming out from a whole lot of American specialists, and everybody was following the lead set out by these American leadership gurus. And leadership was everywhere, but it was very American in its flavor. That seems to have faded somewhat, but it doesn't seem to have been replaced by anything. What is the blueprint for leadership in the world at the moment? It seems a bit hazy.
Well, it's a very good question, because there's no single standard for leadership, right? I mean, if you want to become an artisan, there's a standard, there's a qualification. We don't have that for leadership, and that's what we're trying to co-create. Not we, not me, but and my team, but the leaders. So, and obviously leadership dimensions differ from country to country. So it's a different thing to lead in South Africa than to lead in the US, for example. So what I think we need, blueprint is the right word, we need to co-create a blueprint for leadership in a country, such as South Africa. Bring everybody together and co-create that blueprint.
Now, South Africa socially, especially amongst the black population, has a lot of a flatter social structure than, say, a European-inspired culture with a clear hierarchy. Right? The culture here is a lot more inclusive, collaborative. Does that help or harm leadership?
Well, I mean, if you look at Mandela, who learned leadership by listening to the elders, as he recollected, and always advocated and practiced a model of leadership by leading from behind, right? That's what he said, and that's what he did. I think it's a great model. Consensus is important. We cannot operate exclusively anymore, so inclusivity is an imperative, especially, well, not just in this country, across the world.
Does that not lead to the leadership crisis that we've got at the moment, where you mentioned Mandela, lead from behind? We now have Ramaphosa, which is lead from behind but run away in the other direction and not provide any leadership at all. Is that not a product of lead from behind? Because when you're leading from behind, who keeps an eye on you?
Well, it's a good question. And that's one of the elements we're going to discuss and explore, examine at the summit. So the design school, for example, is going to examine the future of leadership thinking in a complex world. How do you lead an organization, a country, in such a complex world where we have so many interdependencies, globally and locally? How do you do that? Do you do that as an individual? Do you do that as a group? Do you do that as a collective?
We've seen South Africa grapple with this issue, I mean, to our detriment. The number of CEOs at some of the parastatals, obviously the poster child for this has been Eskom, where you literally just go through, leaders as fast as possible. What is causing that kind of instability? Is it the people themselves? Are they not good leaders? Is it the people who should be supporting them that are not, where in your analysis does the problem lie?
In my analysis, lack of innovation. Because we already in 2015, the father of disruptive innovation, Peter Diamandis, who is really leading the field of innovation, disruptive innovation in many aspects. In 2015, he already was saying that we should have free energy. The technology we have available today, we had available back then, already, he said within a few years' time, we should have free energy. The food technology alone. We should come to close to a stage where we can guarantee food security. I believe we have 2 million kids going hungry in this country. That shouldn't be the case, right? So lack of innovation.
Yeah. Now, which brings us to the topic of leadership and technology, because a lot of what you're talking about is managing technological breakthroughs. In the world today, we're using a lot of, we always sort of hark back almost to the days of Mandela, etc., but he didn't have social media to contend with. He didn't have some of the international crises. He didn't have YouTube channels analyzing every move he made. You were SABC and that was it. What is your message to a leader today, right, that comes in understanding that you've got this force for good and for bad being the technology? What do you do as a leader in a world with the technology and the rate at which technology changes?
Well, first of all, AI is truly it's a game changer, as we all know it. So you have to understand AI, you have to learn AI, you have to master AI, and then it comes down to ethical leadership, right? Are we using the advances in technology to control the people, or are we using technology to uplift, to empower? Which obviously we should do. We should empower the people, right? We should help everybody to unleash their potential. I think it was Einstein who said we're using less than 10% of our potential, right?
Yeah.
So that's what we should be looking at.
Now, we mentioned it earlier. We mentioned that globally there's a leadership issue. I think if we could get into that time machine, go back to 2010 even, would have been hard to predict that in very stable Europe, you'd have a war that is led seemingly by an autocratic leader who just decides he's not happy with, I don't know, with his neighbors, what mistake has been made that's led to the situation now that you can have one man seemingly deciding, almost like it's 1940, deciding to invade another country?
Look, I think in Europe what has happened, and I can certainly talk about the state of the nation in Germany,
Yes.
What has happened ever since World War II is that, again, there wasn't innovation, right? There was a status quo peace that was observed, that was managed, but it was not further developed. So now the conflicts that we see breaking out in Europe, they could have been prevented, but they were just not managed. If all you do is look at how can you preserve the status quo, obviously you're not going to co-create solutions for the future, will you? I think that has been the mindset in Europe for a long time. A very traditional mindset. They knew what not to do, but they didn't put mechanisms in place that would build a better future.
Yes. And if one looks at leadership, Germany, it's I know a bit unfair, different, quite a homogenous country. Certainly modern Germany came from the depths of the Second World War. It was clear what the objective could be, and then compare it to South Africa, which came out of an equally bad breakthrough. What has been your experience of the major differences between leadership there and leadership here?
Well, it's a very interesting question, because just looking at the World Cups, there were so many parallels between Germany, the 2006 World Cup, and South Africa 2010. So I was born and bred in Berlin, right, the divided city. The wall came down in '89. Germany was reunited in 1990. And back then, Chancellor Kohl promised that the East Germany would have flowering, quote unquote, flowering landscapes in 5 years. It took them 25 years to rebuild the East. And it took them 25 years to really reunite the people. So it's quite a long process. And I think South Africa is the same. I mean, again, it's about reuniting the people, rebuilding the country. And I think, fortunately, geopolitically, we are in a better position than Germany. Much better. And now with being part of BRICS, I think there's going to be a massive power shift from north to south and from west to east. And so I think that positioning is going to serve us well.
So, once again, it goes back to leadership. You mentioned the German example. There's always seems to be, and the same thing happened here. When you've got certain moments and certain things that can drive the process, leaders will emerge, or people will get onto the same page, to use that term, right, and drive it towards getting it done. We saw that in 2010 here, where there was this understanding that at a point in time, hundreds of thousands of people are going to descend on us. The world's eyes are going to be on us. We better do this. We better pick up the litter,
That's right.
And that sort of common purpose becomes important. You mentioned, Helmut Kohl and now the reunification of Germany. We're going to make the landscape flower. It's a popular thing. What stops us from setting those kind of objectives in South Africa that aren't imposed from the outside? Because it still seems to me that this is our failing in South Africa, is that we're great when somebody else imposes a deadline. We're not that good at saying, you know what, let's not let 2 million kids go to bed hungry at night. Let's make that our objective. Is it just the fact that feeding those 2 million kids doesn't have a ribbon cutting? Is that the problem? From a leadership perspective, how do you see that?
I think, for me, it comes down to us leading very isolated and fragmented lives as a people in this country and many other countries. So again, 99% of South Africa's people are obviously good people. They want to build a better future. They want to uplift the next generation. And for me, it's simply a matter of having a catalyst to work together. If we can work together, if the people can work together across the differences that are there, right? Across the boundaries, if we can work together, I think we can solve many, many problems.
Now, South Africa sits at a crossroads. You mentioned BRICS. Certainly, South Africa seems to be grappling with the issue of looking east and south versus looking north and west, right? I mentioned that my own involvement in leadership development 15 years ago, 20 years ago. It was a lot easier. There was one model. Everybody seemed to be following the model, very much inspired by America. The wall had come down, and it seemed that they were, as somebody coined the phrase, they weren't a superpower, they were a super duper power, right? That image has gone, right? Probably never to return. We now live in a multipolar world. That is clear for all to see. And it's hard to see what replaces that American model, because I don't know what the Chinese model is, because the Chinese model seems to be one man in charge, listen to him, right? The Russian model, one man in charge, listen to him. What is your advice to young leaders? Do you strive to be an autocrat, or do you think there's still hope for inclusive leadership?
I think there's a lot we can learn from India. If you just look at Indian society, it's cohesive. It's a very peaceful society. It's a society that's given birth to many, many leaders in business. For example, the CEO of Google, CEO of Microsoft, they've done amazing things, right?
Yes.
Satya Nadella, great leadership. And now also leading politics in the UK, maybe in the US. They have an Indian candidate running. So I think India is a great model of leadership. And I think if we look at what's really important, other than technology, humanity, I think we can find a lot of humanity in Africa. And I think there's still an element of Ubuntu in South Africa, because I think the way we connect down here is very different to how people connect in other parts of the world. I think it's a lot more humane. I can see the humanity. And we have to bring back humanity into this world.
So you're saying that South Africa, a lot more humanity in the society. This affects leadership styles.
Absolutely.
That's a good thing. one could also argue that it also causes a lot of, while we wait for everybody's contributions and everybody's input, no decisions get made. We seem to have a decision-making problem.
Well, so did Angela Merkel.
Yeah.
Angela Merkel was very, very hesitant to make decisions, and to the detriment of the country. I call it a connected leader. I think as a leader, as a modern leader, you have to be connected. You have to be connected to your constituency. You have to be connected to your fellow leaders. And you have to be connected to your audience. So I think that is part of what modern leaders should look for.
Nick, you get to interact through much of your work with a lot of young South Africans, a diverse range of young South Africans. Do you think that South Africa possesses the leadership talent to start modernizing the country, take it forward, and put an end to some of the woes that we have in South Africa, because the older generation are doing a terrible job?
Well, there are many, not just future, but future-minded leaders. So I've been interviewing 250 leaders across society, and there's some very powerful thinking about the future of leadership, and there is great leadership in action. And all we have to do, elevate them, right? Give them airtime, get them on your show. And I think there's tremendous leadership talent in the country, but it needs to be nurtured, it needs to be encouraged, it needs to be empowered.
What role does the deference in many of our communities to the elders? You know, as I get older, I'm less impressed by the elders, you know, including myself. You get a little bit stuck in your ways, you get a little bit old-fashioned, and, you know, it certainly has been my observation that the less deferential you become to the elders, probably the better you are. It doesn't mean you have to be disrespectful, but just take the advice from whence it comes, right? South Africa has a problem. One just has to look, for example, at our parliament, which looks like an old age home. And those leaders wanting to push through are finding a natural barrier in slightly healthier older people, but not necessarily more innovative. How does one respectfully move that elder aside that's actually standing in the way, blocked by their own years of views of the world that may not be applicable anymore? This must be one of the biggest single challenges we have in the country.
Well, I look at it from a societal point of view, and what I see, for example, in Europe, where they cart off the elderly to an old age home, right, to be forgotten, that to me is the wrong way.
Yes.
I think it's very important to integrate the elderly. And maybe that's not even the right word, because these are senior leaders in many, many regards. And what I've seen so many times, if you create a channel between the future leaders and the current leaders or the past leaders, and you bring them together, that is where the magic happens. That is where you get great ideas and solutions from the interrelation between the past, the present, and the future. And I think it's important that we respect our elders.
Yeah, to a point, right? One must respect the elders, but one must also sometimes see, because, you know, as somebody who's not getting any younger, I understand that I'm not easily moved aside, but sometimes I need to be.
No, you have to.
Yeah, so, you know,
you have to pass on.
Yeah, you got to pass on. So let's approach this from two aspects. From that older, more experienced person, right? How do you create the environment, or what are the signals, or what should you be doing to step aside, to nurture talent, to replace oneself?
Well, I mean, that's the age-old question in business especially, right? Where so many times very senior leaders only have their job in terms of fulfillment. And the minute they retire, they lose meaning, they lose everything. And that's why many, many senior business people die very, well, not young, but shortly after their retirement. So you need to, first of all, have meaning. You have to have purpose. You have to contribute, right? And you have to be part of the system. I mean, if you look at Japan, for example, there's a community with the most centenarians. And they all contribute to society. It doesn't mean that you have to lead until you're 100 years old, but you contribute. You're still part of the system. So don't cast them out, give them a role, and let's work together as one.
And as that young leadership cohort coming through, especially in a South African context, we do have some extremely talented young people that have been exposed to greater levels of education, greater life experience, access to more tools, etc. And sitting up top is some old guy who doesn't want to be dislodged, making bad decisions, or even worse, making no decisions. What's your advice to that young leader?
Well, I mean, many companies are now moving forward. Many companies like Vodacom now have a youth exco, right? And I mean, we've seen it, for example, with the women movement. That's becoming very prominent. I think the youth movement will become as prominent. And we need to give them space and obviously guide them and give them platforms. Yeah, that's what's needed.
Right, so let's once again, you've got your Future Leadership Summit, Maslow, 24th of October.
That's right.
2023. Where do people go to get more information from us?
Well, they go to the website. So it's not a public event.
Yes.
It's a think tank, but on the website, the Future Leader Forum, thefutureleadership.com, you find basically everything about the event. And obviously, we are going to capture the event. We are going to broadcast the event. We're expecting the SABC. And we're going to share the highlights from the event and the resolutions.
Well, Nick, I think today you've shown us that leadership, especially in South Africa, is quite a complex topic. There's lots to consider. It's not just about leadership, and I think it's a global issue. We're living in a world where there's not just one model anymore. We're not just listening to Jack Welch or Stephen Covey as we did maybe 20 years ago. There's many different models. South Africa's in desperate need of leadership. If you are that young leader, it's time for you to start emerging from those shadows and, start showing yourself. To Dr. Nick Eberl, thank you so much for joining us here today. To everybody that's enjoyed this, please subscribe to the channel. And thank you for coming to join us here on the State of the Nation.
Thanks to you. And if I may just say one last word, to me, the most important aspect of leadership is personal leadership. It's how you lead yourself and how you lead the people closest to you, right? Your family, your friends, your colleagues, your peers. You have massive influence over the people that you interact. Do it for good.
There you heard it. Great advice. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you again on the State of the Nation. Thank you.